The night before his hanging arrived without ceremony, slipping over the frontier town like a warm black cloak, and Silas Reed sat alone in the narrow wooden cell beneath the gallows, listening to the wind as it moved through the beams above him, making the rope creak softly, almost thoughtfully, as if even it were curious about the man it would soon hold. And in that quiet, with only a lantern's weak glow and the distant sound of a coyote calling across the plains, Silas finally allowed himself to breathe as he had not in years, not like an outlaw, not like a hunted man, but like a soul standing at the edge of truth. The guards had granted him one last night alone, believing silence would be his only companion, but they did not know that silence was exactly what he feared, because in silence the memories came, slow, unsteady, carrying dust, blood, regret, and something far more dangerous, love, and he spoke then, not loudly, but steadily, as though the night itself were a confessor, telling it that the stories told about him were easier than the truth, that the legend of Silas Reed, cold-hearted gunman and ruthless thief, was built by men who needed a villain and by Silas himself, who found it simpler to wear a monster's face than to explain the choices that had carved him hollow. He confessed that he had not always been this man, that once he had been a quiet ranch hand with dirt under his nails and hope in his chest, that the first life he ever took had not been born of cruelty but panic, a moment when the law wore the wrong badge and mercy never arrived, and from that moment the road bent sharply, carrying him farther from the man he had been and closer to the name that would one day draw crowds to watch him die. The wind pressed harder against the gallows then, as if urging him on, and Silas admitted that every robbery, every narrow escape, every body left behind added weight to a secret he carried deeper than his revolver, because the blood-soaked legend missed the truth that he never rode for riches alone, that much of what he stole vanished into places no sheriff ever looked, widows with empty cupboards, children whose fathers lay beneath unmarked soil, towns forgotten by the law unless it came to collect. Yet he never claimed the title of hero, because even good intentions did not cleanse his hands, and at night he still saw faces, still heard final breaths, still wondered how many wrongs could ever balance the scale. He paused, swallowing hard, and spoke of the woman whose name he had never spoken aloud since the day he left her standing in a doorway with tears she refused to shed, a woman who saw the man beneath the dust and danger and loved him not for the legend but despite it, the one soul who knew his real name and what he dreamed of when the guns were silent. And he confessed that it was for her he first ran, for her safety and her future, because the world had a way of punishing those who stood too close to men like him, and it was easier to be feared than to be mourned. The lantern flickered as Silas leaned back against the cold wall, admitting that each mile he rode away from her carved something out of him, that every cheer from men who admired his defiance rang hollow, because none of them knew the cost, and none of them would stand where he now stood, waiting for dawn with nothing but honesty left. He told the night that the law had finally caught the outlaw but never caught the truth, that the trial had been swift, the verdict certain, because legends do not require understanding, only an ending, and he did not resist, not because he believed himself innocent, but because he was tired of running from the man he had become, tired of pretending that survival was the same as living. The gallows creaked again, louder this time, and Silas closed his eyes, confessing the final secret he had guarded even from himself, that if he had one regret heavier than all the rest, it was not the crimes or the scars, but the hope he never allowed himself to return to, the quiet dream of a life where he laid down his gun and picked up something gentle instead, a life he believed he no longer deserved, yet one he still carried in his chest like a fading ember. He spoke until his voice grew rough, until the night felt fuller, as if it were holding his words for someone else to hear, and when he finally fell silent, the wind softened, the rope stilled, and Silas Reed sat beneath the gallows not as a legend or a monster, but as a man who had finally told the truth, unaware that somewhere beyond the darkness, that truth might still have the power to change what the Wild West believed it knew about him forever. Red Mesa lay stretched beneath the burning western sun like a town that had learned how to endure rather than hope, its buildings bleached pale by years of heat and wind, its people cautious in both word and glance. And when the woman arrived one late afternoon riding alone with a black veil pinned loosely to her hat, the air itself seemed to tighten, because everyone knew the name Mara called her even before she spoke it, knew the quiet legend that followed her like a shadow that never quite detached, the story whispered behind saloon doors and across card tables that every outlaw who had ever loved her had met a violent end, that men who drew close to her did not ride away whole, if they rode away at all. Mara dismounted without drama, her movements calm and deliberate, and rented the small adobe house at the edge of town where the desert began to reclaim what civilization pretended to hold, a place with cracked walls, a stubborn mesquite tree, and a well that groaned when drawn from, and she did not correct the rumors nor confirm them, because she had learned long ago that truth was often less powerful than what people needed to believe, and belief, once formed, was difficult to loosen. She kept to herself, dressed simply, spoke politely, and earned her living mending clothes and tending a small garden that fought the dust with quiet determination. And though men watched her with a mixture of longing and fear, none crossed the invisible line she seemed to carry with her, because Red Mesa was a town that had buried enough bodies and learned which fates were best left undisturbed. Yet beneath the calm of her days, Mara carried her own ghosts, memories of men who had loved fiercely and lived dangerously, men who had sworn they would change, who had promised her sunsets without gunfire and mornings without blood, only to be pulled back into violence by the world that shaped them, leaving her to bury what remained and move on before grief rooted too deeply. And so she told herself that love was not cursed but incompatible with survival, that her heart was not dangerous but simply misplaced in a land that devoured softness. The sun was dipping low one evening, turning the desert copper and gold, when fate, careless and exacting, delivered itself to her doorstep in the form of a wounded gunslinger who collapsed against her door frame. With a sound more tired than dramatic, his blood dark against the dust, his breath shallow and uneven, and for a long moment Mara simply stood there, staring down at him as if recognizing the shape of her past in the lines of his face and the weight of the revolver at his hip, knowing she could close the door, knowing she should, because Red Mesa had rules about trouble and she had rules about survival. But the man's hand twitched weakly and something older than caution stirred within her. Something that remembered who she had been before the widow's veils and fresh graves, and so she dragged him inside with more strength than she realized she still possessed. His name, she learned later, was Jonah Hale, a man whose reputation trailed him unevenly, spoken with both respect and resentment depending on who told the story, a gunslinger known less for cruelty than for being in the wrong place when violence arrived. And as Mara cleaned the wound in his side, working with practiced steadiness, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the quiet argument between sense and sympathy that had undone her before. Yet Jonah did not speak grand promises or plead for salvation. He thanked her softly, apologized for the trouble, and drifted in and out of sleep as if trusting her without knowing why. The days that followed unfolded slowly, marked by heat, healing, and an unspoken understanding that neither of them named. Jonah resting in the small back room while Mara went about her tasks, listening to the town beyond her walls, aware that word would spread as it always did, that someone would notice the extra water drawn from her well or the shadow that moved where only one should. And sure enough, glances grew sharper, conversations quieter, until one afternoon the grocer warned her gently that men were talking, that trouble had a way of finding her, and Mara thanked him with a sad smile because she already knew. Jonah healed steadily, and in the quiet hours they spoke, not of guns or past fights, but of smaller things, of places they had seen and moments that had almost been peaceful. And Mara found herself laughing once, a sound that surprised them both, because it felt like something rediscovered rather than new. And Jonah looked at her then with an expression that held admiration without possession, as though he saw not a curse or a challenge but a woman who had endured. Yet beneath the gentleness, tension coiled like a rattlesnake warming itself, because Jonah was not blind to the whispers or the careful distance townsfolk kept. And one night, as the desert wind pressed against the house and stars burned cold and bright above them, he asked her the question he had been avoiding, asking why men who loved her seemed to die, and Mara answered him honestly, telling him that she did not believe herself cursed, only unwilling to ask men to change in a world that punished hesitation, telling him she had loved outlaws because outlaws were honest about the danger they carried, and that she had learned too late that love alone could not soften a violent life. Jonah listened without interruption, and when she finished, he said quietly that he did not believe fate hunted people for loving, but he did believe choices mattered. And that struck her more deeply than any promise could have, because it left space for uncertainty instead of illusion. Days passed, the wound closed, and Jonah grew restless, not from pain but from the knowledge that staying would draw attention neither of them could afford, and Mara felt the familiar ache of an ending approaching, the quiet grief that came before loss rather than after, and though neither spoke of love, it hung between them in glances held a moment too long and silences waited with meaning. The town's patience finally frayed when a group of men rode in asking questions, their eyes sharp and their hands never far from their weapons, and Mara knew then that Red Mesa would not protect what it feared, that the story of the widow and the gunslinger would end the same way if allowed to continue, and that loving someone sometimes meant refusing to let them stay. On the morning Jonah planned to leave, The sun rose fierce and unforgiving, and Mara stood with him at the edge of the desert, handing back his revolver with a steadiness that cost her more than she would admit, and Jonah looked at her as if memorizing her, as if this moment mattered more than any gunfight he had survived, and he told her he did not regret finding her door, that if fate was cruel, it was also precise, because it had given him something real even if briefly. Mara watched him ride away until he became a dark mark against the endless light, her heart heavy but intact, believing she had done the kind of thing, unaware that the story did not end there, that love once awakened rarely returns quietly to sleep, and that the widow of Red Mesa had not escaped fate at all, but merely stepped deeper into its patient, unrelenting weave beneath the burning western sun. Deadwood Crossing appeared at dawn like a place the world had decided to forget, its buildings sagging beneath years of neglect, its streets carved deep with ruts left by wagons that no longer came, and when the lone rider approached from the east, dust clinging to his coat and weariness etched into the lines of his face, no one rushed to greet him, because this was a town that trusted neither strangers nor salvation. Yet the man rode straight down the main road and stopped before the empty marshal's office, staring at the faded sign as if it were a mirror reflecting something he had tried hard not to recognize, and the badge pinned to his chest caught the early light in a way that felt almost accusing, because Thomas Cole had sworn he would never wear it again. He dismounted slowly, every movement measured, as though his body remembered pain even when it slept, and the townsfolk watched from doorways and windows, recognizing the shape of authority long before they believed in it, because Deadwood Crossing had not known law in years, only deals made in shadows and justice measured by the size of a man's following, and Thomas knew knew the kind of town he had ridden into, because once, long ago, he had failed a place just like it, and the memory of that failure rode with him heavier than his saddle. The badge had belonged to another marshal, a better one, a friend who had died when Thomas hesitated, when fear had slipped between duty and action and chosen for him, leaving blood in the street and a town that never forgave. And Thomas had carried that moment with him across territories, across years, telling himself that he was done with law, done with choosing sides that ended in graves, until a letter reached him bearing a familiar name and a plea written in a hand grown desperate, asking him to come to Deadwood Crossing because no one else would, because something worse than lawlessness had taken root. The town's tension revealed itself quickly, in the way conversations stopped when certain men passed, in the way shopkeepers kept ledgers hidden and eyes lowered, in the way children learned early which streets to avoid, and Thomas saw all of it without needing explanation, because he had once been the man who promised to stop such things and failed, and now he stood at the edge of another beginning that felt too much like an ending. He took the marshal's office not because anyone asked him to, but because no one stopped him, and inside he found dust, broken furniture, and a cell door hanging loose on one hinge, the quiet evidence of years without order. And as he cleaned, methodically and without ceremony, he felt the weight of the badge settle not on his chest but in his hands, each movement a small act of defiance against the past. Word spread by afternoon that a marshal had come, and with it came the men who ruled Deadwood Crossing, a loose alliance of ranchers, smugglers, and hired guns led by a man named Briggs Harlow, whose smile never reached his eyes and whose authority rested on fear rather than respect. And Briggs visited the office with polite menace, testing Thomas with questions and half-jokes, offering protection in exchange for cooperation, and Thomas refused him quietly, knowing exactly what that refusal would cost, knowing that war did not announce itself with gunfire but with decisions. The town reacted in cautious fragments, some hopeful, some resentful, because law threatened comfort as much as it promised safety, and Thomas spent his days walking the streets, listening more than speaking, learning who still believed in rules and who benefited from their absence, and at night he sat alone in the office, the past creeping in through the cracks, replaying the moment he froze, the sound of the gunshot that came too late, the eyes of the man who died because Thomas had waited, and he wondered if courage could be relearned or if it was something spent once and never returned. The answer came not in reflection but in blood, when a shopkeeper was beaten for refusing to pay, and Thomas arrived too late to prevent it but soon enough to see the cost of inaction written across the man's face, and something hardened in him then, not anger but resolve, the understanding that failure repeated was worse than failure remembered, and he began to act, arresting men who believed themselves untouchable, reopening the jail, calling for witnesses who had long since learned to stay silent, and with each step the town leaned closer to conflict, because Briggs Harlow did not lose power gracefully. The marshal received warnings in the form of broken windows and whispered threats, and Thomas took them without complaint, because fear no longer surprised him, it only clarified what was at stake. and he trained a small group of deputies from among the townsfolk who still believed in something better, men and women who had lost enough to risk losing more, and together they prepared for the moment when Deadwood Crossing would have to choose between surrender and survival. The past confronted Thomas openly one evening when he recognized one of Briggs's men as someone who had been present at his earlier failure, a man who remembered Thomas's hesitation and wore it like a shield, taunting him with it in front of the town, and Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old instinct to step back, to let the moment pass, but this time he did not. This time he met the man's gaze and held it, speaking calmly, refusing to be defined by the worst thing he had ever done, and in that refusal something shifted, subtle but real, as if the town itself exhaled. The final confrontation arrived not with a single battle but with a long, grinding tension that broke into violence across Deadwood Crossing when Briggs moved to reclaim control, and the streets filled with noise and chaos, shots fired more in panic than precision, and Thomas moved through it with a steadiness that surprised even him, not fearless but present, making decisions quickly, protecting those who could not protect themselves, and when he faced Briggs at last, it was not the past that guided his hand but the clarity of the moment, and the conflict ended not with triumph but with exhaustion, with the town standing in the aftermath of what it had nearly lost. When the dust settled, Deadwood Crossing looked different, not healed but possible, and Thomas stood alone again in the marshal's office, the badge heavy but no longer accusing, because he understood now that failure did not disqualify him from trying again, that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it, and as the town prepared to rebuild, Thomas Cole, the last marshal of Deadwood Crossing, faced the ghosts of his past not as chains but as reminders of why the badge mattered, knowing that redemption was not a single moment but a choice made again and again, even in a town that had forgotten what law once meant. Black Canyon was a place spoken of only when the fire burned low and voices dropped to uneasy murmurs, a deep scar in the land where sunlight seemed reluctant to linger and even the wind changed its tone, and when Caleb Doran found the map, creased and brittle inside the false bottom of a trader's chest, he did not believe the stories at first, because desperation has a way of softening disbelief, and Caleb had known desperation for most of his life, known it in the dry cough of empty wells, in the way hunger sharpened the edges of thought, in the quiet shame of watching stronger men claim what little opportunity passed through frontier towns. The map was marked crudely, ink faded to the color of old bruises, pointing toward a vein of gold hidden deep within Black Canyon, the words, Devil's Due, scrawled along the margin in a hand that trembled even in memory, and Caleb told himself it was nothing more than superstition, that men blamed the land when greed devoured them. Yet when he folded the map and tucked it close to his chest, he felt a strange warmth there, not comfort but awareness, as though something had noticed him in return. He set out at dawn, crossing the desert alone, his mule plodding faithfully as the sun climbed and the world stretched wide and merciless, and at first the journey felt ordinary enough, the silence broken only by the creak of leather and the whisper of sand against stone, but by the second night, as Caleb camped beneath a sky crowded with stars, he heard it, a sound just beyond the reach of understanding, not quite a voice and not quite the wind, murmuring his name with a familiarity that tightened his chest, and he told himself it was exhaustion, that solitude could play tricks on a man's mind, yet he slept poorly, dreams filled with gold veins twisting like roots through black stone, pulsing faintly as though alive. The closer he drew to Black Canyon, the heavier the air became, carrying a sense of expectation that pressed against him from all sides, and the whispers returned more clearly then, promising relief from years of want, promising respect, security, a life no longer balanced on the edge of loss, and Caleb found himself answering them aloud without meaning to, bargaining with shadows, justifying what he would do with the gold, how he would use it wisely, kindly. Unlike the men whose bones were rumored to line the canyon floor, Black Canyon revealed itself at last as a jagged wound splitting the earth, its walls steep and dark, swallowing sound and light alike, and as Caleb descended, rope biting into his hands, he felt a presence settle around him, patient and observant, the whispers growing nearer, no longer drifting but circling, guiding him deeper until he found the vein exactly where the map promised, gold threaded thickly through obsidian rock, gleaming dully as though absorbing rather than reflecting light, and in that moment awe overcame fear, because the promise was real, solid beneath his fingers, enough wealth to erase every failure he had ever carried. He worked feverishly, chipping away at the stone, filling his pack with more than he could safely carry, and the canyon seemed to breathe with him, the whispers swelling into a chorus that praised his determination, his courage, yet beneath their approval lay a quiet insistence, urging him to take more, always more, until his hands bled and his back screamed in protest, and still he could not stop, because each piece of gold felt like an answer to every question he had ever asked the world. Night fell unnoticed, the canyon darkening until only the faint glow of his lantern remained, and it was then that the whispers changed, their tone sharpening, reminding him that gifts carried obligations, that nothing taken from Black Canyon went unpaid, and Caleb felt the first true stab of fear then, realizing he could not recall exactly when he had agreed to anything at all. When the choice had slipped from his grasp, he tried to leave, struggled up the rope with his heavy pack, but the canyon seemed to stretch, distances lengthening, footholds crumbling beneath his boots, and the voices laughed softly, not cruelly but with the certainty of something that had waited a very long time for him, reminding him of every small compromise that had led him here. Every moment he had told himself survival justified the cost, and he understood then that the price was not sudden or dramatic but cumulative, paid in pieces of oneself surrendered willingly. Caleb reached the rim at dawn, collapsing onto the desert floor, breath ragged, heart pounding, and for a moment he believed he had escaped, that daylight had broken the spell. But when he opened his pack to count his fortune, the gold lay dull and lifeless, heavy as regret, and the whispers returned one last time, instructing him to spend it, to spread its influence, to let the canyon's hunger travel with him into towns and lives that had never known it. And Caleb realized with horror that the curse was not bound to the gold alone but to the desire it awakened, to the way it reshaped a man's choices until he could no longer tell where his will ended and the canyon's began. He wandered for days after that, haunted and hollow-eyed, unable to part with the gold yet terrified of what it demanded, and when he finally staggered into a settlement, the people there noticed something wrong at once, the way he flinched at whispers, the way his gaze slid toward the horizon as if listening for a call only he could hear, and though he traded small pieces of gold for food and water, relief never came, only the slow realization that Black Canyon had followed him out, not as a place but as a presence, feeding on the quiet greed it stirred in others. And Caleb understood too late that the true devil's gold was not the metal buried in stone but the promise that suffering could be escaped without cost. His end came quietly, not with fire or madness, but with exhaustion, found one morning beneath a cottonwood tree with his pack empty and his eyes fixed wide open, as if watching something recede into the distance. And when the townsfolk buried him, they found no gold on his body at all, only the map, its ink now fresh and dark, waiting patiently for the next desperate soul to believe that Black Canyon's whispers were an offer rather than a warning. And so the legend endured, carried on the wind across the desert, a reminder that some riches ask not for blood or fire, but for something far more easily surrendered, and far more difficult to reclaim.